Welcome to part 2 of chapter 3. My camera stopped working, unfortunately, again, so there's no video of me in this part of the slideshow, so you're not missing anything, but I will be going over the slides for you. So we talked about a variety of the different ethical issues that we might face in social science research, but there are some types of criminal justice studies that present special ethical problems in addition to the ones that we've already discussed. So these are things like staff misbehavior, research causes crime itself, and the problem of withholding desirable treatments from some people. So let's go through all these. So staff misbehavior. Researchers that are doing field observations, field studies, may observe the staff that they are evaluating do something unethical, immoral, or possibly illegal. And it's then the researcher has to decide, should I report this person or should I just mark it down as part of my study and continue forward? You're not necessarily studying the staff, you're evaluating a policy or maybe evaluating the people that the staff are in charge of. And so they might not be protected by the same level of confidentiality that the research subject might be. So here it's really, up to the researcher to kind of decide what they should do. So your book gives a really great example of, let's say you were evaluating a program, and while you're evaluating the effectiveness of that program, you notice that some of the staff aren't performing their duties. So particularly in the example that your book gives, police officers or probation officers are supposed to visit with their clients on a one-on-one basis, and the researcher found that that wasn't what was happening, and instead of actually going and visiting their clients as frequently as they were supposed to, they were just going occasionally, if at all, and they were forging the forms that they were supposed to be filling out during these visits and turning them in even if they hadn't actually gone to see the individual. And so in that instance, it's not necessarily that they needed to report those probation or police officers for not doing their job. They were evaluating the effectiveness of the program. So their evaluation itself is going to tell the supervisors that they weren't doing their job, and so it's rendering the program ineffective. So in that situation, the research itself kind of told on those subjects. But if that wasn't the case, it would be really up to the researcher as to whether or not they felt that they should intervene and maybe inform somebody what was about the malpractices that were going on. So the next one is research causes crime. And this is particularly important for our criminal justice research. So some research projects have the potential to produce crime or influence different factors that are involved. So obviously it's unethical to encourage someone to commit crime solely for the purpose of research. So for example, we wouldn't want to test out how drugs are related to crime by giving all these people drugs to take and encouraging them to take drugs. That's not something that we want to encourage as researchers. But when we're studying a highly delinquent population, they might, especially field researchers, they might get involved in criminal behavior without wanting to or, needing to. So for example, when studying a highly delinquent population like gangs, they might want to prove their violence or delinquency to the researcher by committing crime in front of them. So what do you do in that type of situation? Obviously the researchers that your book talks about turned down any invite to do a drive-by shooting with them. And so that's pretty much the route a researcher should take, turn it down, don't be a part of anything that is illegal if you can help it. And obviously, you don't want to encourage them to do something violent or delinquent just to prove themselves for the study. Turn it down. So it also says that sometimes it's difficult to recognize when research might indirectly promote crime. And here they're specifically talking about something like the cash incentives that are given out to participants to study crime. If you are giving out, $5, $10, it might not seem like a lot of money, but what if the person who's in that study then turns around and uses that money to go and buy drugs or something? You as the researcher don't necessarily have responsibilities in that way. Once you give the cash incentive to participate in the study, it's up to them how they're going to spend it. And you as the researcher can't really tell them what to do with the money that they have. But understanding that might be a possibility because you are interviewing a delinquent population is just something to keep in mind on when you're deciding how much money you want to actually be giving. Also, it's, sometimes research can influence the location of criminal behavior. The possibility of crime displacement in studies of crime prevention programs is a good example. So let's say there's an experimental program to reduce street prostitution in one area of the city. And so we decide that, there's going to be a crackdown. We're going to increase police presence. We're going to make more arrests for prostitution. And so that area of the city might see lower rates of prostitution, but it's not necessarily because prostitution has stopped. Maybe it's just moved to a different part of the neighborhood. The people who are working the streets get wind of this research that's going on, this new program, and they decide, okay, well, I'm just going to move my location to a different spot, and then I won't have to deal with this. So in that way, you might just be influencing the location of where crime is happening. So withholding desirable treatments, the best examples to use for this come from the medical field, but this happens in criminal justice research as well. So just to make things super clear, in the medical field, researchers are testing the effectiveness of experimental drugs, and they may find that the drugs cure the medical ailment that's being studied because the experimental group who's actually getting the drug and not the placebo starts to improve dramatically, and the control group, is still experiencing their symptoms. Although, this type of research is necessary, or we would not ever be able to develop new drugs. We have to test them. We have to do it over a certain period of time so we can make sure that we've actually successfully addressed the symptoms that we're trying to address and not having any dangerous or adverse reactions to the medication. Usually in medical studies, when they find positive results like that, they offer them to the control group who is receiving only the placebo after the conclusion of the medical study. And if someone is, usually during a medical study too, they're constantly under the supervision of a doctor. So if their illness got to the point where it was, causing some serious problems, they would be receiving some type of medical care one way or another. So, how do we deal with this within criminology? One solution that they have is to interrupt an experiment if preliminary results indicate that the new treatment is going to produce improvements. So this, the best example of this in criminal justice is when we're dealing with incarcerated populations and the prevention programs that they receive. So cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a way to address how individuals cognitively process a situation, has been shown to be effective in reducing recidivism rates. And when people do studies looking at the benefits of cognitive behavioral therapy, they oftentimes will have a control group and experimental group. And when they see improvements with the experimental group, they will include other members, into the program as soon as they've collected enough data. So it's very similar to what they do in the medical field, stopping things early and including everybody so that everyone can gain the benefits once we know for sure that there is a benefit. Okay, so there are many different organizations and associations and federal, state, professional, that all have their ethical principles that they overlap a lot, and we tend to follow all of them. There are copious federal regulations that have stemmed from these 3 specific principles from what's known as the Belmont Report. So the Belmont Report was a way to deal with unethical issues that have been arising in the medical and social science research. So there are a couple of highly publicized experiments that were considered highly unethical, which we'll talk about 2 of them at the end of this chapter. And so this report basically looked at everything that went wrong and tried to come up with ways to prevent this stuff from happening in the future. And so they came up with these 3 principles in particular. And like I said, many of the federal regulations that we have stem from these 3 principles. So the first one being respect for persons. Individuals must be allowed to make their own decisions about participation. Remember, we talked about voluntary participation. And those with limited capacity should have special protection. So there are considered protected groups of research studies. We talked about, prisoners, juveniles would be another protected class. And so this way, people that could easily be coerced into research or don't necessarily have the cognitive capacity to voluntarily agree to do research are protected by federal regulations. Beneficence is another thing to keep in mind. So research should do no harm to participants. We talked about that at the very beginning, and seek to produce benefits. And when we find those benefits, when we find out there is a benefit, we want to include everyone who was a part of the research study into those benefits. Again, that goes along with this 3rd point of justice. The benefits and burdens of participating in research should be distributed fairly. So if we have 2 groups of really sick people and we're dividing them into an experimental and control group, and the experimental group starts to thrive while the control group is on their deathbed, that's when it comes time to make that ethical decision. Okay, we need to end this study a little early and start giving the people in the control group some of this drug that's showing these amazing benefits. So, many of our, ethical principles that we have in criminology stem from these 3 principles. And you can see that when we're talking about ethics in criminal justice research. Okay, so remember what we talked about when we said that professionals who design and conduct research projects can often fail to recognize ethical problems because maybe it's something that they overlook when they are excited about designing their study. So how can such problems be avoided? The research community has adopted 2 general ways to promote ethical research practices. The first one is the Code of Professional Ethics. Most academic disciplines, most professional disciplines have associations that everyone subscribes to and follows. Within criminology, we have the American Society of Criminology, ASC, and we also have the we have ACJS, which is basically ASC for juveniles. They're the 2 national associations representing criminology and criminal justice research in the United States. And these are the professional associations that come up with the ethical standards that we follow in our own research. So sociology has the American Sociological Association. If you are a doctor, you have the American Medical Association. This is our version of those things. We have the American Society of Criminology and ACJS. I always get tongue-tied with that one. My apologies. So they have created, code of ethics that lays out what is considered acceptable and unacceptable behavior when we are performing research. They draw extensively on codes that were already developed. So criminology stems heavily from sociology, like we talked about. So we followed very closely with the American Sociological Association's Code of Ethics because we deal with same types of things. So some of the basic principles from the ASC 2016 code, which comes from your book, is to comply with appropriate federal and institutional requirements pertaining to the proper review and approval for research that involves human subjects, materials, and procedures. So basically making sure that we follow the rules. Don't mislead respondents to purposes for which research is being conducted. Ensure participants' rights of personal anonymity unless they are otherwise waived. You have to let people know if it's not going to be anonymous. Ensure confidentiality of any data not obtained from records open to public scrutiny. So we talked about this. If you can't guarantee anonymity, you have to be able to guarantee confidentiality. And confidentiality in criminal justice research is so important when we're trying to get people to answer honestly about potentially illegal behavior that they are committing. So part of the federal regulations that are in this country come from the Department of Health and Human Services. And so a lot of these issues that we've had some serious ethical issues in social science research, but much, much more comes from the medical field. There have been horrible, unethical studies done in the medical field, and although it's advanced our knowledge, there's probably a better way to go about understanding these topics without, putting people in harm's way. So because of this, the Department of Health and Human Services has established regulations protecting human research subjects. And this is where we get the IRB, the Institutional Review Boards. These are agencies and organizations that conduct research involving human subjects must establish review committees. So an IRB can be a federal review board. Every university that conducts research typically has their own IRB, and this way they are the ones that review any research projects that are going to involve a human subject before the research project can get started. So the researcher goes to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, with their plan and their research question, and they tell them, okay, this is what I'm planning on doing, this is how I'm planning on doing it, and this is who I'm planning on studying. And so the Institutional Review Board will go over the study to make sure that there's no ethical issues that are being overlooked, and they will make recommendations if necessary. So under the Department of Health and Human Services regulations, virtually all research that uses human subjects in any way is subject to IRB review. There are a lot of exceptions in social science research because of how we study individuals. A lot of the IRB stuff is made to directly talk about issues in the medical field. So this is why we see a lot of exceptions for social science research, but they're getting more and more strict just to make sure that everything is looked over. So just because you might get an exception for your research, you still need to submit it to the IRB, and they're the ones that will let you know, oh yes, this doesn't need extra approval, we can expedite this through, or maybe the opposite, and they'll say, there's a problem with this, and we need to look at this more thoroughly. The exceptions are typically studies that collect anonymous information, and a lot of times we are able to collect anonymous information. So it's safe to assume that most research is subject to IRB review if original data will be collected from individuals whose identities will be known. So if it's not anonymous, it's going to get a little more scrutiny from the IRB just to make sure that you're protecting people's information. But that's about it in social science research, unless you are performing an experiment that's going to cause people to change something that they normally do in their life and not just report past behavior, then you're going to get a little bit more IRB scrutiny. Like I said, every institution that does research has one of these. So universities, national think tanks, political think tanks, they all are supposed to have an IRB that makes sure, it's a panel of individuals, and they're making sure that no, ethical violations are happening. Oh, sorry. Gotta go back. So when we're talking about informed consent in special populations, so informed consent can be tricky. We already talked about this a little bit. The norm of voluntary participation is usually satisfied through informed consent. So if you want people to volunteer for your study, you basically will tell them what your study is about, tell them over and over again that they're not required to participate, but they can choose to, and then if they choose to participate, this is what's going to happen. And then after you go through all of that, so the informed consent is going to contain things about, they're going to, inform subjects about research procedures, what the goals of the projects are, potential risks that are involved with the project, and then obtain their consent to actually participate. So, that sounds easy enough that you can just tell people, okay, this is what I'm studying, and if you would like to be a part of it, just sign here. But obviously, this could be an issue depending on what it is we're trying to study. So some of the practical difficulties that come with getting informed consent when we're doing criminal justice research is stuff like when deception is an important part of the experiment. Researchers have to make a choice, and so typically they'll get around informing participants by telling subjects only part of the truth or offering a slightly revised version of why their research is being conducted. That's kind of a way to get around it. If telling the subject straight up what the research project is going to do and what the goals are going to change that person's behavior, then that is deemed an acceptable way to gain their informed consent without actually telling them the whole truth. Another problem is ensuring that subjects have the capacity to understand the descriptions of risks, benefits, procedures, etc. And this often happens, this is why we talk about special populations in particular, but if you are doing a study on the mentally ill and trying to understand how somebody with a mental disorder is more likely to commit a type of criminal behavior, you have to make sure that the person that you're trying to do research on, so someone who is mentally ill, has the mental capacity to understand that they are choosing to participate in a research study, and that they understand what the research study entails, and that they're actually okay with it. And so obviously, depending on the population that you're trying to study, that's going to be more difficult for some than others. But that is, a requirement. So this might require maybe an oral description instead of just handing them a form to read themselves. Maybe if they speak a different language, you're trying to do some research on immigration, and you need somebody to translate what's happening with your study into a different language for you. You have to make sure that the subjects are fully understanding what they're agreeing to participate in. So however you need to do that, depending on who the population is you're trying to study, you have to make sure that that gets done. It's super important when it comes to carrying out a research study. So when we talk about special populations, in particular for criminal justice research, juveniles and prisoners are considered special populations. Also mentally ill are considered special populations. And so if they are considered a special population, they have extra criteria that needs to be met in order to satisfy the fact that they gave informed consent. So for juveniles, this typically means that parents are necessary. So you have to have the juvenile agree and have their parents agree to them. participating in the study. In situations where the parent may not be readily available, you have to have an advocate for that child that's available, that's part of their life, that can sign for them. Prisoners are, oftentimes considered high risk because they're in prison and they may feel coerced or pressured into performing or to being part of a research study because they think that they're going to get some type of special treatment if they do participate, or maybe they think that they're going to get punished if they don't. And so it is, imperative that we make sure that prisoners understand, this has no effect on the outcome of their sentence. And this has, it's not going to count against them or benefit them in any way. We also have to just make sure that they understand what's going on in the research study. A lot of times prisoners have low IQ, and so we need to make sure that they fully understand what they're agreeing to participate in, because terrible things have happened in the past where prisoners have been looked at as, less than human, and researchers have taken advantage of that and their easy accessibility. So this makes them considered high risk research group. And so we have these special protections put in place to stop things like that from happening. So the Department of Health and Human Services, the regulations specify that prisoner subjects may not be exposed to risks that would be considered excessive for non-prison subjects. Undue influence or coercion cannot be used in recruiting prisoner subjects. Informed consent must indicate that a decision not to participate in a study will have no influence on work assignments, privileges, or parole decisions. They also require a special IRB council where at least one member is either a prisoner or someone specifically designated to represent the interests of prisoners, to help ensure that all the ethical issues involved with doing research within a prison are recognized and dealt with. So basically, it takes someone to know what's going on inside a prison to be able to recognize some of the issues that might come up when doing research on that population. So they must be included on the IRB board. So researchers often don't like having to deal with IRB boards for several different reasons. At the very least, it's inconvenient to have an outsider review your research project. They might not fully grasp the implications of the research study. They might not understand your field and how things are typically done in your field. And they might try to alter things that would, alter the outcome of the study, and that's not what you want to do. So, oftentimes researchers get annoyed by IRBs, but it's important to remember why they're in place. They're in place to protect everybody, not just the research subjects, but that's obviously the primary goal, but also the researchers, to make sure that they don't perform any unethical research studies that might get them into trouble later on. So if a IRB doesn't fully grasp the implications of the research study, they might determine that any potential harm, including small inconveniences such as just taking the time to complete a survey or something, outweighs any good that can come from the study, and they might dismiss it altogether. And in that case, if you're that researcher, you have to make sure that they understand why you are choosing to do this study in the first place. Convince them that there is some potential from completing the study. Sometimes people who review research for IRB approval are not familiar with different types of criminal justice research. So maybe they are all in the medical field and they don't really understand social science research, and they don't understand why you are asking certain questions certain ways. So again, that's just going to be a lot of back and forth between the board members and the researcher so that everyone fully understands what's going on and what is considered typical practice. Much of the original impetus for establishing IRBs, so the main reasons for, original reasons for establishing IRBs had to do with medical experimentation on humans. Many social research study designs are regarded as exempt from IRB review under federal guidelines, because we talked about this. A lot of our stuff is anonymous or comes from public records, and in that case, we don't really need to have these special protections. So I know researchers oftentimes get annoyed with IRBs, but also it's important to realize that they can be sources of expert advice on how to solve any ethical dilemmas. So not only can they recognize if there is an issue, but oftentimes, they can be used as a resource to solve that ethical issue for your research project. So they serve some good also. Okay, so 2 of the most controversial studies within social science are discussed at the end of your chapter. The first one, known as the Stanford Prison Experiment, and you most likely have heard of this before. It's pretty popular. So this video is about 10.5 minutes long, and it goes over what the experiment was like, what it entailed in detail, and the outcome of the study and the different ethical issues that we learned from it. So the Stanford Prison Experiment, the biggest issue that it had overall was the fact that the researchers really didn't know what to expect. And so because they didn't necessarily know what to expect, they didn't have very strict rules on how things should be done during the experiment. But they did, do a lot of things right in that experiment as well. So watch the video and go over it. You can read about it in your book, but I'm going to just, give a very brief synopsis. So they were looking at 2 different hypotheses. The first one, or overall, they were looking at how do people behave in formal institutions. And they did this using a lab setting where they created their own prison. And they were looking at 2 different hypotheses, one being a dispositional hypothesis, meaning that prisons are brutal and dehumanizing because of the types of people who run them and are who incarcerated in them. So here they said, it's the people in the prison that make it a terrible experience and not necessarily the prison itself. Okay. Then we have the situational hypothesis, which is the complete opposite. So this is saying that the prison environment itself creates brutal, dehumanizing conditions independent of the kinds of people who live and work in the institutions. So because we only see prisoners in a prison, people that have committed crimes, they, hold on one second. Sorry about that stuttering. I just got interrupted, so I'm just gonna keep going on. So that's what they were looking at. So they couldn't do this project in a real prison because everyone who's in a prison has a criminal record, criminal background, and they're trying to understand, is it the people or the prison that make the difference? And so they recruited, college kids to participate in their study. They gave them, psychological tests, criminal background checks, and all these things to try to find who they considered, quote unquote, the most normal of all of the volunteers for this. So they had planned a 2-week study to investigate their hypotheses, but the study was actually ended in 6 days. And this is because the subjects started to display unexpectedly intense reactions, before those 2 weeks were up. So 5 people were actually released before those 6 days for showing signs of acute depression and anxiety. The researchers here, they were very sensitive to the ethical issues because they did things like give informed consent to the participants. They, told them what was going on fully in the experiment. The researchers also recognized when the experiment started to go wrong. They released people early when they felt like they were having psychological harm. They ended the entire experiment over a week early because of the intense reactions that were happening. They offered group therapy debriefing sessions to all the participants, so psychological care, and they followed up with all the participants for a year to make sure that any negative effects were only temporary, and that they can talk it out. But the subjects were not fully informed of all the procedures that were going to be happening. And part of that, it was because the researchers themselves didn't necessarily know what to expect and what to do, so they kind of just let things play out. And when they did that, they, found out some things about human behavior that they weren't necessarily expecting. So this relates to the second problem, which were that when the group was divided into prisoners and guards, they were told, to become either a prisoner or a guard. And the guards were granted the power to make up and modify rules as the study progressed. And what the researchers found was that their behavior became increasingly authoritarian, and they really, accepted their roles almost too much and became, they had the option to be nice to the prisoners and to treat them well because this was a research study. There were no rules on how they had to act, but they went the complete opposite way with it and became really aggressive and authoritarian to the people that were, prisoners that they knew that didn't do anything wrong. They were, part of this research study too. So it was really interesting to see how that stuff played out, but it was also I'm sure pretty scary for the researchers that were having to watch these ethical dilemmas play out in real life. So watch the video, it's interesting. So, trouble in the tea room. So this is pretty interesting study that, I can't remember his first name, Laud Humphrey did on male homosexual acts. So his research focused on male homosexual acts between strangers who met in the public restrooms at parks. So this guy, Humphrey, basically act as a lookout or a person who was interested in watching these random sexual acts happen between men in public restrooms. And he wanted to know more information about, what this was all about, why people did this, what their life was like. And so he watched what was happening. He also recorded their license plate number and some information about them, and then went to their house and did a follow-up study. And there was no informed consent about what was happening, and these people did not understand that they were part of a research project that was going on. So obviously that's a lot of red flags right there. This was before that Belmont report, and this is a big reason as to why that Belmont report even became a thing. So what Humphreys found was that the participants in these homosexual acts in public restrooms seemed to lead otherwise conventional lives as family men. The homosexual, most of them were not considered homosexual. So the fact that, these men lived completely different lives and this, act that was happening, made the confidentiality part of this study, pretty crucial. So as to not damage anyone's lives or reputations. And at this time, homosexuality was actually illegal. So people could actually get arrested for performing homosexual acts, especially in public. So, that adds another layer of importance to this needing to be confidential information. And so if you read through the study, read through it on your book, you have to ask yourself certain questions like how, if in any way, did Humphrey try to protect the subject's privacy that he had? There was no informed consent, there was no voluntary participation, but also have to think, how could you perform such research and study such topics with informed consent? There are definitely better ways than others to do things like that. You never want to coerce or trick someone into participating in a research study. So, read this stuff, read it through, and give it some thought, because when you are coming up with your own research projects, you want to make sure that You're coming up with research projects that follow all of the rules of ethics. You can't, give people drugs. You can't make them commit crime. You want to make sure that you're not taking advantage of special populations. So, when you're reading through these studies, ask yourself, what did they do wrong and what could be done differently, if anything, in order to study these topics. And that's that.